Would you hand your child over to a mysterious cult, knowing you would never see him again, just to ensure he was fed? In the 1840s in the United States, this wasn't a theoretical question. It was a desperate choice that fueled one of the strangest, most thriving, and most feared communities in American history. They were known as Shakers, and to the outside world, their walled villages weren't homes of faith, but places where bizarre rituals took place and children disappeared. Imagine rural America in the 1840s. Not the bustling coastal cities, but the vast, wild, and often brutal interior of New York, New England, or Kentucky. The nation was young, turbulent, swept by waves of religious fervor known as the Second Great Awakening. Prophets and new religions sprang up and vanished like mushrooms after the rain, but none were like the Shakers. Officially, the United Society of Believers in the Second Appearing of Christ. To their neighbors, they were simply those from the walled community on the hilltop. They were prosperous, no one could deny that. Their farms were the cleanest, their barns the sturdiest, their furniture, now worth fortunes, of legendary simplicity and quality. They were inventors, creating everything from clothespins to circular saws. Their villages were the epitome of order, cleanliness, and wealth. But this prosperity came at a price: total isolation. Shaker villages were designed to be worlds apart. They traded with the outside world, selling their products with an honesty that became their trademark, but they didn't mingle. They were pacifists, refusing to fight in wars. They didn't vote. They lived by their own rules, their own laws, their own hierarchy. And this seclusion, this inexplicable wealth that seemed to spring from nowhere, fueled a deep and dark suspicion. The neighbors, living in often precarious wooden cabins, looked at those massive, immaculate structures and wondered, what really goes on inside? What do they do to be so successful? What are they hiding? The answer, when glimpsed, was more shocking than any conspiracy theory. The real horror, by the standards of the time, was happening in plain sight, inside their meeting houses. Shaker religious services were not the solemn hymns and restrained sermons of neighboring Methodist or Baptist churches. They were explosions of ecstatic chaos. A lost traveler or a curious neighbor hiding in the bushes on a Sunday evening would not hear silent prayers. He would hear the sound of dozens of feet pounding the wooden floor in a frenetic, escalating rhythm, a sound like that of a runaway train. He would see men and women, dressed in their simple blue and gray uniforms, lined up in separate rows, beginning to tremble. First, a slight tremor in their hands, then in their shoulders, until their entire bodies were seized by violent convulsions. They didn't call themselves Shakers for nothing. They believed they were literally shaking sin from their body, shaking pride, lust, and greed out of their flesh. But the trembling was only the beginning. The music grew faster, the drums pounded, and the trembling exploded into dance. Not a social dance, but a frenzied abandon, spinning, jumping, waving arms in the air as if in agony or ecstasy. And then came the screams, high-pitched screams, howls, sounds that seemed like animals. And, most terrifying of all, glossolalia, speaking in tongues, incomprehensible words, hissing sounds, a cacophony that seemed to come from another world. To the Shakers, this was the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, a divine gift. To the farmer outside, hidden in the dark, this was unmistakable proof, demonic possession, mass madness, dangerous and blasphemous rituals that could summon the devil himself upon him. These stories spread like wildfire, painting the Shakers as a cult of dangerous madmen. hiding behind their facade of order and wealth. But if the ecstatic rituals were what shocked the neighbor, the central rule of the Shaker faith was what challenged the very foundation of 19th century society. It was a rule that, to the outside world, was seen as morbid, unnatural, and impossible. Strict and mandatory celibacy. In an era when the family was the central economic and social unit, where be fruitful and multiply was a biblical and practical mandate, the Shakers forbade all forms of sexual contact. Men and women could not marry. In fact, they lived in large communal families, but they were strictly separated. They called each other brother and sister. They used separate entrances to their homes. They climbed separate staircases to their separate dormitories. They ate at separate tables in the refectory, in silence so as not to provoke inappropriate conversations. Work was divided by gender, and any interaction between the sexes was rigidly monitored by the elders. This rule was the core of their theology. They believed that lust was the root of all sin, the cause of Adam and Eve's fall. To achieve purity and build the kingdom of God on earth, carnal desire had to be eradicated. To Victorian society outside, which was obsessed with family legacies, land inheritance, and the sanctity of marriage, even if often hypocritically, this was an abomination. It was seen as a perversion of the natural order, a recipe for insanity. How could men and women live so closely together in a closed community and deny humanity's most basic impulse? The suspicion was obvious. They had that they were lying. Behind that facade of purity, far worse things must have been happening. Secret orgies, pagan fertility rituals. Anything was easier to believe than the truth that they simply didn't do it. This led to the deepest and most practical mystery of all. If the Shakers were strictly celibate, if no babies were born within their walls, how on earth did the sect not only survive but grow exponentially? By the 1840s, they were at their peak, with thousands of members scattered across dozens of prosperous villages. Where did all these people come from? The answer had two parts, and the second was the most disturbing to the outside world. The first source was the conversion of adults. The religious fervor of the time brought many weary and disillusioned souls to their doors. Widows, widowers, people who had lost everything in economic crises sought the security, order, and promise of salvation that the Shakers offered. They surrendered all their property to the community in exchange for a lifetime of sustenance and spiritual purpose. But the most crucial source, and the one that fueled the darkest stories, was another: mass adoption. The Shakers actively recruited children. They would go to overcrowded orphanages, which were little more than warehouses of misery. They would approach destitute families, devastated by disease or alcoholism, offering to raise their children. For a widowed mother in 1840, unable to feed her 5 children, the Shaker offer seemed like a divine blessing. Her children would be fed, clothed, educated, and taught a valuable trade. In return, she would sign a document, often an apprenticeship contract or legal guardianship, handing the child over to the society until they reached adulthood. This is where the mystery deepens and the stories of disappearances begin. This was the real gain for the neighbors and the heart of the panic surrounding the sect. For a mother who entrusted her 6-year-old son to the Shakers, the reality of the decision only set in months later. When she went to the community to visit her son, she was received with cold politeness. Perhaps she could see him briefly under the watchful eye of an elder. The child would be dressed in the Shaker uniform, his hair cut in the Shaker style. He might seem healthy, but distant. On the next visit, perhaps she would be told that the child was busy with his studies. On the following visit, that it was not convenient. Soon the gate would close on her. The child, once crossing the threshold of the Shaker village, was completely assimilated. Contact with the outside world was cut off. Letters were discouraged, then forbidden. The child was taught to see their Shaker caregivers as their new spiritual parents and their biological family as part of the sinful world they had left behind. To the family outside, to the small town the child came from, they had, for all intents and purposes, disappeared. They had been swallowed up by the walled community. And since the law was on the Shaker side, the guardianship papers were legally binding, there was nothing the family could do. Rumors spread. The children weren't just being adopted, they were being kidnapped. They were being brainwashed. They were being used in strange rituals. The total silence emanating from the community about the fate of these children was more deafening and terrifying than any scream. And what happened to these children and to the converted adults inside? The secret life of the Shakers was a paradox of tranquility and intense psychological control. Order was absolute. A bell woke everyone before dawn. A bell called them to silent meals. A bell sent them to work. Men in the fields and workshops, women in the kitchens and looms. Everything was communal. No one owned anything. The clothes you wore, the bed you slept in, the tools you used, everything belonged to the family. This, in itself, was a way of erasing individual identity. The uniforms reinforced this. Everyone looked the same, humble servants of God. But the darkest aspect of this control was not physical, it was mental. It was the public confession sessions. Regularly, community members gathered in small groups to confess their sins to one another. And the most watched, the most feared sin was the carnal one. Members were forced to publicly admit any impure thought, any lingering gaze at a member of the opposite sex, any unnatural dream or desire. Imagine the psychological pressure, living in an environment where your own thoughts were considered a betrayal, where your neighbors, your brothers and sisters were also your monitors and judges. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance, not only by the elders, but by everyone. Purity was maintained through public shaming and the forced eradication of privacy. For the Shakers, this was a necessary purification process. For a modern observer, it is a highly effective form of worship control. Inevitably, not everyone could withstand this pressure. History is full of accounts of apostates, those who abandoned the faith, and it is these stories that ignited the fire of hysteria in the outside world. Let's dramatize a scenario based on these accounts. Call him Thomas, a young man who joined the Shakers after the death of his parents. For 2 years, he lived under the rule. He worked in the fields, confessed his thoughts, tried to believe, but doubt and the natural desires of youth consumed him. He couldn't bear the ecstatic dances, which seemed terrifying to him, or the constant surveillance. One night, he decides to run away. He waits for the last bell, the absolute silence of the village. With his heart pounding in his chest, he slips out of his dormitory, avoiding the creaking floorboards. He runs through the perfectly manicured fields, expecting at any moment to hear the alarm cry. He scales the stone wall in the darkness and runs, without looking back, towards the flickering light of the nearest town tavern. He bursts into the place muddy and breathless, to the shock of the local drinkers. And he tells his story. He speaks of the screams in the night, of the dances that seemed like possession. He speaks of the lost children, those who were adopted and now seem like soulless automatons. He speaks of the forced confessions, of the fear, and most shockingly, he speaks of a child who was ill and was not taken to a mundane doctor, being treated only with prayers and Shaker herbs until disappearing, probably, he insinuates, buried in an unmarked grave. These stories, told by a terrified and genuine eyewitness, were the proof the outside world needed. They were no longer just suspicions, it was testimony. With stories like Thomas's circulating, the pressure on local authorities became unbearable. Neighbours, already frightened by the rituals and jealous of the Shaker prosperity, demanded action. The local sheriff, perhaps a pragmatic man who had previously seen the Shakers merely as strange neighbours but good businessmen, now had no choice. He gathers a small group and rides to the gates of the Shaker community. The investigation, however, is one of the most frustrating experiences of his life. He is not met with hostility, but with an uncanny calm and steely politeness. The elders of the community receive him in an impeccably clean meeting room. They offer him fresh cider. The sheriff demands to see the children. The elders readily agree. The children are brought in. They are clean, well-fed, rosy cheeks with health. They are dressed in their simple uniforms and answer the sheriff's questions with a rehearsed quietness and respect. "Are you happy here, child?" "Yes, sir." "Do they treat you well?" "Yes, sir." The sheriff asks to see the records. The Shakers present impeccable legal documents for each child, signed by county officials or the biological parents. They have lawyers, very good lawyers, who calmly explain to the sheriff that he is trespassing on private property. The sheriff mentions the apostate stories about wild rituals. The elder smiles gently and says, "Brother Thomas was confused. Our worship is enthusiastic. It's the joy of the Spirit. Perhaps the world isn't ready to understand it." The sheriff looks around. He sees order, prosperity, health. He sees perfectly aligned orchards, barns full of grain. There is nothing he can arrest, no obvious law being broken. The apparent order and prosperity directly contradict the wild stories of possession and abuse. He leaves the community empty-handed, frustrated, feeling there is a wall of silence he cannot penetrate, but without any proof of a crime. And this brings us to the bizarre truth revealed. The shocking conspiracy the neighbors feared didn't exist, at least not in the way they imagined. There were no demonic sacrifices, nor mass kidnappings in the criminal sense. The shocking truth, the conspiracy, was the sect's own rules. The ecstatic rituals, they were exactly what the Shakers said they were, their literal way of worshipping God and shaking off sin, a practice they derived from French Protestant groups and developed into something uniquely their own, the disappearances of the children. They were, in most cases, legal adoptions or apprenticeship contracts, protected by the law of the time. The children were indeed cut off from the outside world, but they were not, usually, physically abused. They received education, food, and shelter at a level far superior to what they would have known in the slums or orphanages from which they came. They were, however, subjected to intense psychological indoctrination to ensure they remained in the faith. The truth was that the Shakers had built a functional utopia based on rules that the outside world considered insane. They were living proof that a society based on celibacy, communal property, and ecstatic worship could function and even thrive. And, in a way, This truth was almost stranger and more disturbing to 19th century society than conspiracy theories. It was a living challenge to their way of life. In the end, the story of the Shakers concludes with the most macabre irony of all. The final disappearance was not that of a child, but of the sect itself. The central rule that made them so mysterious and, paradoxically, so successful, celibacy, was precisely what caused their extinction. Total celibacy meant that all human energy, which would normally be spent raising children and on family dynamics, was redirected to work, invention, and worship. This made them incredibly productive and wealthy. But without the ability to reproduce biologically, they depended entirely on conversion and adoption to survive. And as the 19th century progressed, the world changed. The Industrial Revolution made their handcrafted goods less competitive. State orphanages and social welfare programs improved, and poor families had options other than handing their children over to the Shakers. Waves of religious fervor subsided. Adult conversions dried up. Adopted children, upon reaching adulthood, now had an attractive outside world to escape to, and many did. The entire sect began to disappear. Village after village closed its doors throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The thousands of members dwindled to hundreds, then dozens. Today, only a handful of Shakers remain, living in a single community in Maine. What's left are their perfectly preserved ghost villages, with their double staircases and strange, functional architecture. And they left behind the enduring mystery of their bizarre rituals and the silent legacy of the children who vanished into their utopia, saved from material poverty but lost forever in a world of incomprehensible rules and frenetic dance. If you were moved by this story, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below what you liked most. Your opinion is very important to us. Share this video with someone who needs an inspiring story. Until next time.